Hey guys, what's up? I'm guessing you clicked this video because you shot some log footage and it just doesn't look as good as you expect. It's well known that shooting with log will expand your dynamic range and offer more detail in the shadows in your videos. Shooting with log will create a high quality, professional look as compared to shooting with a normal standard profile. However, there's specific ways you need to expose log in order to get the most out of it. So let's break it down. In the past, log profiles were only found on high-end cinema cameras. Lucky for us, you can find it on a lot of DSLRs and mirrorless cameras today. The difference between shooting log and shooting with a non-log profile happens where the sensor translates light in each pixel into voltages that are recorded as an exposure profile. These voltages are recorded as a linear range when shooting with non-log standard profiles. When shooting with a log profile, the exposure values are recorded in a logarithmic curve. And you thought you would never use algebra again. Basically, a logarithmic curve shifts the lower and middle parts of the dynamic range into the upper parts of the dynamic range where there's more bit depth. Future Matt here. I really went down the rabbit hole talking about a lot of technical stuff in that video. I bet you're watching this video to get some quick and easy exposure advice for shooting log. So I'm re-recording this video and I'm simply going to show you how I expose for log. I use two methods. One method is when I'm shooting a human and skin exposure is the most important part of the video. The other method is when I'm exposing for an entire scene. Let's get started with the method that I use for exposing an entire scene. When I'm exposing a scene, I want to bring up the shadows as much as possible and retain as much detail as I can without blowing out my highlights. To do that, I overexpose the scene, and shooting with log is what allows me to do it without blowing out my highlights. Simply put, more light hits the sensor, creating a cleaner image. Then later in post, I adjust it how I want. This process makes my images look much cleaner with a lot of detail in the shadows with very little noise. So how do I do it? I don't guess. I don't use the light meter. What I use is a histogram. Simply go into your display settings and set the histogram to be on your display. The histogram shows me the exposure of all the pixels in my image. The pixels touching the left border of the histogram are completely black with no detail. The pixels touching the right border of the histogram are completely white with no detail. So what I do is I slowly adjust the exposure to move pixels toward the right side of the histogram, but I want to make sure I don't get too close to the right border or touch the border on the right side of that histogram. Any pixels that do touch the right side border of the histogram is a blown out part of your image. And that's how I get the highlights of my video overexposed without completely blowing them out. And this in turn brings up my shadows, revealing more detail. One thing that's really important is the display on your camera will show the image being blown out on the highlights. Don't trust that, trust the histogram. The histogram is always right. One other important thing to keep in mind, make sure that your ISO isn't set any lower than the native ISO for the log profile on your camera. Doing this will actually decrease your dynamic range. If you don't know what the native ISO is for the log setting on your camera, go ahead and do a quick Google search and I'm sure you'll find it pretty easily. Another thing to keep in mind is that the input LUTs that your camera manufacturer designed for log footage are designed specifically for perfectly exposed footage. So if you apply an input LUT to overexposed footage, it's going to blow out the highlights. There's a specific way of applying input LUTs to keep this from happening, but the order of operation is very important. I'm working on a video that'll show you how to properly apply input LUTs to log footage. Should be coming out in a couple weeks. If that's something you're interested in, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the bell. That way you're notified as soon as I upload the video. So that's how I expose a scene shooting log footage. I expose for skin tones much differently, and that's what we're going to talk about now. It'll seem complicated at first, but I'll show you an easy way to do it. It's super important to expose skin tones accurately, otherwise your subject will look like an alien. And that's why I had my buddy Ansel Adams to help me out. Ansel Adams was an OG photographer who helped develop the zone system that's still being used as a standard today. The zone system shows proper exposure levels for dark, average, and light colored skin. Zone 5 for dark skin, 6 for average skin, and zone 7 for light pale skin, which happens to represent 50, 60, and 70 on the Luma wave. So the Luma wave matches Ansel Adams' zone system. Weird. I target an average skin tone, which is 60%, and then I lighten or darken in post to achieve darker skin or lighter skin. But 60% is a number I want to target when I'm color grading in post, not when I'm shooting in log. I found an exposure curve from Canon to help me determine that I should target approximately 40% luminance for average skin tones when I'm shooting with log. When I hit the 40% luminance on skin tones in camera, it'll jump up to my color corrected target of 60% when I drop an input LUT on the footage. Which brings up another point. When you're color correcting log footage, be sure to use the input LUT that your manufacturer for your camera designed. The input LUT from your manufacturer will have the mathematical formulas to transform your log footage into more of a standard footage that has proper exposure levels and color levels. I don't recommend using third-party LUTs on log footage because you don't know what you're getting. If you want to use third-party creative LUTs on your already graded footage, go for it, but don't add them to your log clips that haven't been graded yet. If you're a Canon shooter, there's about 120 different correction LUTs available, and it's super confusing to understand which one you should use. I'm currently working on a video that shows the correct LUT to use for different shooting profiles with Canon. I should be uploading that in about 3 weeks, so if that's something you're interested in, go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell, so that way you're notified once that video comes out. Alright, back to exposing skin tones. I know it seems complicated at this point, but now I'm going to show you an easy way to achieve those targets. So how do I hit 40% luminance for my skin tones? I don't have waveform on my camera, and I also don't desire bringing around an external monitor everywhere I shoot. So I use zebras. Not those zebras, these zebras. Zebras makes it really easy to nail 40% exposure on skin tones. All I have to do is go in the camera settings and set the zebra value to 40 plus or minus 5%. So basically my zebras show up on anything in my image that is exposed between 35 and 45%. To take it a step further, I want the zebras to land on the highlights of my subject, not the shadows. I think that makes skin tones look really nice. But I don't want those zebras to be on my EVF all the time. So I programmed a button on my camera so I could easily toggle them on and off when I need them. So remember how I recommended overexposing log footage to take advantage of its properties? I recommend overexposing for skin tones as well for the same reasons. So after I get the zebras on the highlights of the face, I start to overexpose the image by about 1 or 2 stops. While I'm doing that, I pay close attention to the histogram to make sure I'm not blowing out highlights in the process. I should note that sometimes blowing out highlights is unavoidable when you're trying to expose for skin tones. Picture your subject being in a forest, for example, and under the canopy of trees, they're going to be in the shadows. In that scenario, the dappled rays of sunshine peeking between the trees might be overexposed. But that's okay, because the most important part of that particular scene is your subject, so you want to make sure that you have the skin tones exposed properly. So for a quick recap, when I'm exposing for an overall scene, I'll expose to the right of the histogram, but I'll make sure I'm not blowing out the highlights by having pixels touch the right side border of the histogram. When I'm exposing for a human subject, I'll set my zebras to 40%. Then I will up my exposure until the zebras are at least covering the highlights on the face of my subject. Then I'll take it a step further and begin to overexpose the image as long as I'm able to do it without blowing out my highlights, which is usually about 1 to 2 stops. So there you have it. That's how you expose for log. If you're still watching this video, I'm really happy I was able to keep your interest. Consider subscribing. That's it for me. I'm out.